say, are you still claiming that the NHS is up for sale? Because your document doesn't seem to show any such thing.
Well, read the documents that were discussed in secret and the government refused to release them between themselves and the US administration about access to public services and the extension of the life of patents on medicines, which would increase medicine costs in this country. Okay. President Trump has said many times people pay too little for US medicines around the world. That's the kind of agenda the Prime Minister wants to get involved with. That's the kind of deal they're trying to make with the USA.
Boris Johnson, he says you want to sell the NHS.
I have to say, this is pure Bermuda Triangle stuff. We've heard it time and time again from the Labour Party during this election campaign. We'll be hearing about Little Green Men next. I believe very passionately in I use the NHS, I love it. It's one of the most incredible things about this country. It is admired around the world. The central idea that if any of us get sick, all of us take care of them. It's a fantastic thing. Now, we believe in an NHS free at the point of use, and under no circumstances will we sell it off to anybody in any kind of a trade deal. I would just remind.
You don't dispute, though, do you, Mr. Johnson? You don't dispute what he's quoted, which is that American trade negotiators say they want more access to the NHS.
And I've made it absolutely clear to everybody that under no circumstances will that happen. And the biggest privatisation of the NHS, of course, took place under the last Labour government, which put in the ruinous PFI system. And I've gone round many hospitals talking to fantastic staff and management there who are bearing the burden of that debt.
Jeremy Corbyn.
We will now have to deal with
it. I just remind you that your party opposed the formation of the NHS in the first place.
Well, you're now going back to 1940. And I know that you have a long memory in politics.
It is factually so.
I mean, you're quite right.
It is factually so, but the more important thing is that your party has presided over cuts in our NHS, increased waiting times and waiting lists, record number of people delayed in getting appointments, and a social care system that is in crisis.
And there are 17,000 more nurses now than there were under the Labour Party, and that's because we've had a strong economy that's enabled us to make investments, and we are now going to step those investments up, because we believe passionately in the NHS. And the way to take this country forward, the way to get it moving, is to get rid of the blockade in Parliament, get Brexit done and move on.
There are 43,000...
one nation majority Conservative government.
Let me just ask you, Mr.
Corbyn. There are 43,000 nurse vacancies. That's the fact.
Understood. Now, you sent an email on behalf of the Labour Party saying, imagine opening a 5-figure bill for your cancer treatment. Do you accept that that is totally misleading? There is no possibility of anybody having NHS cancer treatment and having to pay a 5-figure
If you end up with a privatised service, that's what you get. If you end up with that US trade deal, that is what you get. Now, the Prime Minister says he's not going to do that sort of a trade deal. If that's the case, why did the talks go on for 2 years? It doesn't take 2 years to say no to privatisation of the NHS.
OK, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. We've got lots and lots of questions to get through. I want to give you the chance to move on. Now, because we've had lots of questions, one or two we're going to make rather quicker than the rest. I'll come to one of those in just a second. You can join in this debate, of course. Hashtag BBC Debate on social media. And before we return to one of our longer questions, we've got an interesting question here from Phil Wason, who has written in, can't be here tonight, which has the better track record of raising the standards, the living standards of the poor, socialism or capitalism? Jeremy Corbyn.
Socialism carried out in a democratic way in this country, in Scandinavia and other places, has raised the living standards of the very poorest. And it was the post-war Labour government that did massively to improve the living standards of the poorest working class communities in this country. And our Labour government will do the same again.
And I would say that it is one nation conservatism, which understands the vital importance of a dynamic market economy as the only way in which you can pay for fantastic public services and for giving and for looking after the poorest and neediest in our society. That is the balance and symmetry at the heart of what I'm trying to achieve with this government. And I think that to attack capitalism, as Mr. Corbyn and Mr. McDonnell do, is absolutely senseless. And by the way, to continue to attack all free trade is, I also think, I think ignorant of the fact.
Just to be clear, Mr. Johnson, do you think he wants to destroy capitalism? Do you? Is that your view?
John McDonnell, who is the Shadow Chancellor, and some would say the intellectual driving force behind this type of paleo socialism, is committed, he says, to fomenting the overthrow of capitalism. Okay. I think that is a mistake. I don't think that's the right way forward for our country. I believe in supporting businesses. I believe in cutting business rates.
My kind of socialism is one where you don't leave people behind. You don't ignore the fact that 4 million of our children are living in poverty. You don't ignore the fact that there are thousands of people sleeping on the streets of this country. The fifth richest country in the world. The inequality has got worse. 150 billionaires in Britain, more people poor than ever.
Jeremy Corbyn,
thank you. Right.
We're going to turn on to a broader question. We're moving on to a broader question about the economy, so both of the leaders will have the chance to talk at greater length. Andrew Brooke has our next question. Andrew Brooke, please.
Thank you. Both of you say that if you're asked to form a government next week, you'll spend, making your plans, your expenditure plans, that is, seem like a fantasy. How are we really going to pay for everything that you are promising?
Andrew Brooke, thank you very much indeed. Spend. Well, he says you're both going to do, gentlemen. He wants to know how both of you are going to pay, or rather how we're going to pay for your plans.
Well,
Boris Johnson.
Andrew, thank you very much. And we will certainly be making some big investments in, as I say, in the NHS, in putting more police on the streets, in lifting up our education funding for every school in the country. And we're going to continue with that. But what we won't do is borrow hugely to fund day-to-day investment. And that is the mistake that the Labour Party would make. They would rack up our debts. They would put up spending to 1.2 trillion. To answer your question, what that would mean is a tax burden of £2,400 per taxpayer. And you hear from Labour sometimes that the burden is, I think Mr Corbyn said it just now, the burden is going to fall only on the 150 billionaires or the top 5%. Actually, people on as little as £20,000 a year under their plans will be paying £1,000 a year more in tax.
Jeremy Corbyn, he says the people who are not rich will pay for your plans.
We're very clear about that, and we are the only party that's produced a fully costed manifesto with a grey book that adds up to every piece of expenditure we want. The problem with this country is we've gone too far down the road of free market economics. We've created too much inequality, and if every single bit of our manifesto was carried out tomorrow, we would just about reach the level of the public services of France or Germany. That is how far backwards we've gone. There has to be investment in our schools. Why are so many children in oversized classes? Why are so many children growing up in insecure housing because there isn't the sufficiency of council housing available? Why are there so many people waiting for social care? Why do so many people in middle age have to go into debt to pay for their kids to go through university and the social care that their older parents need? It's simply time to invest in our future.
Thank you, Boris Johnson.
And I agree. And I agree, but the difference between Mr Corbyn and myself is that his plans, and we, as I say, we will be making substantial investments within the fiscal headroom that we have, but whilst bearing down on our debt over the life of the Parliament. But what we won't do is rack up such debts that the markets demand a higher interest rate, and you end up with huge tax burdens falling on everybody else. Labour always ends their time in office with an economic crisis. Corbyn and McDonnell would start their time in office with an economic crisis.
Mr Corbyn, he says that all of us will pay more in our taxes, not just the rich. And independent think tanks like the Institute of Fiscal Studies agree. That's what they say.
They don't agree with that point, actually.
Clearly not true, they said, of your claim that only the top 5% of earners would pay more.
They questioned some aspects of our programme, and we're happy to discuss that with them, but we are the party that actually produced the funding of it. The Conservative Party have produced nothing in the way of how they're going to pay for anything they suggest they're doing other than tax cuts. It's very hard to see how you can expand services if you're cutting the income base of government in the first place.
It's a fair question,
What we're simply saying is there has to be investment to deal with the inequalities within our society.
How do you pretend to cut taxes and pay for more, Mr Johnson says?
Labour didn't produce the funding for anything. I'm afraid it's the hard work of the British people, and it's British companies, it's British businesses, large and small, that produce the funding that pays for our National Health Service and everything else. And we're a government that understands that if you're going to have a dynamic market economy, you cannot clobber them. You cannot clobber companies with the highest taxes in Europe, which is what Mr. Corbyn and the Labour Party would do. It would be entirely wrong for this country to go down the route that they are proposing.
I quoted the IFS at Mr. Corbyn. Let me quote them at you. He says, your prospectus, say the Institute of Fiscal Studies, top economic think tank, your prospectus, they say, is not credible. They say you haven't said how you'll pay for social care, you haven't said how you'll pay for future tax. That's not credible, they say.
Well, on the contrary, our programme is fully costed. It's there in the manifesto, and it's a great, great programme. And the one other advantage that we have, apart from not wrecking the economy and not having a fiscal meltdown, which is what Labour always do, putting up taxes for everybody, we would get our country moving forwards again by getting Brexit done. And the economic drag anchor of Brexit on this country should not be underestimated. It is stopping investment. It means that people are uncertain about making purchases, about taking on new jobs.
What
it is
Conservative governments always do is look after the very richest within our society. They've done very, very well in the years of austerity, while it's communities all over the country that have paid for it with closed libraries, closed swimming pools, out-of-reach pricing on sports facilities, lack of housing, increased stress, increased mental health stress. We have to redress the imbalances within our society.
Somebody on 20k
our tax proposals for corporation tax would be to raise it to 26% at the end of the first period of that Labour government, which would actually be lower than it was in 2010, lower than it is in France, lower than it is in the USA. What we're proposing is a serious set of plans in order to start addressing the imbalances within our society.
So Boris
and I think it's important to do that.
His claim is basically that Labour would just bring us into line with many countries around the world and Western Europe.
I think it's quite incredible that Mr. Corbyn should claim that people on £20,000 a year are amongst the richest in society and therefore deserve to be clobbered by his tax increases. I think that is totally wrong. The burden of taxation always falls most heavily on those on modest and low incomes. That is what will happen if Labour are allowed to get in. If we have
That's because you've taken the burden off the richest.
If we have a Corbyn-Sturgeon coalition, I'm afraid it will lead to an economic disaster, and worse still, it will lead to the political stalemate, the frustration for business that wants to get on, the uncertainty of not knowing what the position on Brexit is. And we still haven't heard from Mr. Corbyn, this debate has now been running for 35 minutes, whether he's in favour of the deal that he was about to do and how he would negotiate.
You know what
I still don't know.
You know what the business organisations tell me is they can't stand the uncertainty of this government. They can't stand the idea of a no-deal exit. They want to make sure they're able to continue that trade and continue that just-in-time delivery system that is so important in manufacturing industry. And they are constantly concerned at the lack of understanding of how industry works from a Conservative government that claims to be in support of those industries.
What he said to you, Mr. Corbyn, I want to give you the chance to answer it, is that businesses, even ones that were in favour of Remain, want certainty, they want clarity, they want to get it done. What's your answer to him?
With us, you will get a deal which would be leave, but leave with a trade arrangement, or you get Remain, which will obviously carry on the current situation. But they would have the certainty of knowing what the trade relationship is, where the investment's going to come from, and where the market is for the goods that are made in this country. It's kind of important to know those things.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Very briefly.
I think it is important to know those things, but it's absolutely unclear what that deal would be, what Mr. Corbyn proposes to leave, and who in his party proposes to campaign for the deal he's going to do.
You've made that point very well earlier on. Let's turn to another question now, very important subject, given the events of recent days, the issue of security. And the question comes from Richard Boustred. Mr. Boustred, please.
Your most important responsibility if you become Prime Minister in a week's time will be to keep us safe. Given the terror attacks we've seen on the streets of London, are you prepared to put public safety ahead of human rights?
Jeremy Corbyn, will you put public safety ahead of human rights, Mr. Boustred asks?
It's not an either-or. You obviously have to keep the public safe. You have to ensure that the police are there and properly funded. You have to ensure the prison system works and is effective. that the parole board works and is effective, that the probation service works and is effective. You have to give people that security. You don't get security on the cheap. You have to invest in it. Human rights are our defence against autocracy and our defence against abuse of power. There is no difference between wanting security and human rights. The two things are actually inextricably linked together.
Boris Johnson?
Yes, well, I see absolutely no reason to compromise people's human rights, such as the perpetrator of the atrocious killings at London Bridge. But I do think that it was extraordinary and wrong that he should be out on early release and automatic early release. And I said long before I became Prime Minister that we needed to campaign against short sentences. I said in August that we should get rid of automatic early release, and I've been very, very sad to see this guy out on the streets, able to do what he did. And we have a bill waiting to go, stuck because of the blockade in Parliament. If we can get a working majority, we can get rid of automatic early release and make sure for serious sexual and violent offenders, and make sure that terrorists, people who are convicted of terrorist offences, serve their full sentence. I think that is what this country would expect. And
what is wrong, Mr Corbyn, with the idea? Just put that point, Jim, and I'll come back to you. What is wrong with the idea that Boris Johnson spells out there that terrorists, particularly terrorists, should serve their full sentence?
You have to run a prison system and a judicial system in a proper way. You have to have a prison system that works. One day, pretty well all prisoners are going to come out at some point. But if you don't run a prison system that includes rehabilitation, and you don't have a proper assessment of people before they're given any form of early release and a proper review of those cases, then there's obviously a danger to all of us. And so what happened on the streets of London was utterly appalling. And I was very moved by what Jack Merritt's father said about what his son was trying to do, that he wanted a society where you did address the huge problems where somebody committed awful acts like that. Yes, of course you must imprison them. Yes, of course you must try and rehabilitate them if you can. But there has to be a monitoring process to achieve that. We need the security on our streets. Security doesn't come on the cheap. And if you cut the number of police officers, cut the number of PCSOs, privatise the probation service, underfund all the other aspects of the criminal justice system, then we all pay a price with our own security.
Mr Johnson, will you deal first of all, please? Jack Merritt's father did say that Jack lived and in the end died for a society in which, quotes, where we do not lock up and throw away the key, where we focus on rehabilitation, he said, and not revenge.
Of course. And I have huge sympathy for Mr Merritt and the relatives, families of both victims, and it was an absolutely terrible thing. But I still think it's wrong that somebody like Usman Khan, who was sentenced to 21 years or 16 years plus 5 on licence, should have been out automatically on 8 years, after 8 years, when the judge, when he was first convicted, made it clear that he was a very serious jihadi and a risk to public safety. And under our government, under my government, of course, we won't want to be compromising people's human rights. Of course we won't, but we must put public safety first.
It was the courts that quashed that, wasn't it? It was the courts that quashed that.
Automatic early release in such cases is, I think, completely unreasonable, and we will get rid of it.
Could you address Mr Corbyn's point, though, that you have decimated the probation service, the prison service as well, many thousands fewer prison officers, and the probation service as well as police officers during the era of austerity?
But, Nick, I mean, just on a small point of fact, I mean, there was no parole or probation involved in this. He was released automatically. But your point, and there was nothing that any parole board or probation officer could do about that. That was the nature of the sentence. But there is a valid question about how now we make sure that we have a criminal justice system that protects everybody and delivers justice. And we are putting...
We're going to get a rare moment of agreement. You may be agreeing.
Well, we are putting a huge amount of cash into our criminal justice system. I do believe that it should run smoothly, and we're putting another 2.5 billion into our prison system.
Jeremy Corbyn.
You can only do that if you have a strong economy.
We have seriously overcrowded prisons. We've lost a lot of prison officers. And when a prison is overcrowded and there's a shortage of officers, the first thing that goes is education. The next thing that goes is rehabilitation. The next thing that goes is medical support and so on. So you end up with a breeding ground for all the horrors of the future. If we go down that road, we all pay a price. So I'm simply saying this: let's invest in our prison system, invest in rehabilitation, invest crucially in a probation service that works. It was privatised by this government, and we're saying it should be completely in public ownership.
I just want to make sure you're answering a point he made. Mr. Johnson said to you, in this particular case, it was not about resource, it was not about the parole board or probation, he says, it was about sentences. And you're opposed to the change he wants to make.
What I've said is there should be a review of the individual prisoner before release is countenanced. That, I think, is absolutely clear, and that's why I asked for a role for both the parole board as well as the probation service in this, because, listen, what happened was unbelievably appalling, and therefore we have to keep people safe and secure, but you don't do that by underinvesting in rehabilitation programmes as well for all prisoners.
Well, look, with great respect, Mr. Corbyn has, throughout his career, has consistently opposed longer sentences, and when you look at MI5, the body that keeps us safe, particularly from terror attacks, he's proposing to put in a Home Secretary in the form of Diane Abbott, who has called for MI5 to be disbanded. Mr. Corbyn, with great respect to him, I do not, when you look at the huge issues of safety on public streets, knife crime, you have a Labour Party that is adamantly sceptical, opposed to stop and search, which I believe is an integral part of fighting crime on our streets. We're not only going to put 20,000 more officers on the streets of London, we're going to fight the streets of this country, we're going to fight crime in the way that I did in London, but we're going to back the police up.
Let's get
this is
your response
from the
to that.
government that cut the police force by such massive numbers, privatised our probation service, and got rid of all of our PCSOs in many parts of the country.
Forgive me, Mr. Corbyn, you made the point about cuts. His point to you is that your Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, wants to, he claims, you tell us, wanted in the past at least to disband MI5, and that you've opposed tougher sentences.
Whatsoever to disband MI5 or any other part of the security services. There are plans to invest properly in our police and security services. And when you live and represent an area like mine, where somebody was murdered on the streets by a far-right terrorist attack on an individual, you realise how horrific that is for the community and how dangerous that is for all of us. Yes, we do need to invest in all of our services, and that will help to make us all a lot safer.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Let us move on now to Toby Mayhew, who has a question for us. Toby Mayhew, please.
From accusations of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in major parties to threats made against female MPs, what would you do to get the hate out of politics?
What would you do to get the hate out of politics? Toby Mayhew has, and he mentions Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and the threat against female MPs. Boris Johnson, I'm going to ask both you leaders to address problems in your own parties to begin with. Of course, you may want to make points about other parties. So,
well, Toby, I think you're making a very important point, and everybody feels it at the moment. This is a very rough time in politics. There's a lot of feeling at the moment, and I think on prejudice, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, what we're doing in our party is having an independent inquiry into anybody who's guilty of any such offence, and they're out first bounce if they're guilty. I think when it comes to the protection, particularly of female MPs and of women in politics, it's vital that we give them the security that they need, and we're doing a huge amount in the House of Commons to deliver that. What we need to do is, we need to come together as a country. We've been going at this for too long. And that one of the things, and that this is, I'm afraid this is my key point tonight, the scratchiness of politics, the bitterness, the acrimony, is a function of our inability to get Brexit done.
Understood, but on this specific point of Islamophobia that we have,
we can do it, and we will. And we can be out on January the 31st and end what I think is misery for the country.
On the specific point about Islamophobia, and then I'm going to turn to Mr. Corbyn on anti-Semitism, you say people come out at first bounce, but you have candidates who have retweeted Tommy Robinson talking about, quotes, Muslim paedophiles, and a former chair of the Conservative Party says we have a serious and deep problem with Islamophobia.
Yeah, sorry.
Please.
But very quickly, all those candidates have either apologised or are now subject to investigation. And I don't want to unnecessarily draw comparisons with the Labour Party, but I do think it extraordinary that in this election we've heard for the first time in history the chief rabbi say that he fears for his community in this country were Mr Corbyn to be elected. And I think it's a quite extraordinary state of affairs.
Jeremy Corbyn, it is extraordinary, isn't it, that the leader of a religious community has to warn people about you and your party?
Anti-Semitism is wrong and totally unacceptable in our society, in our parties, in our political life, and the history of the awful treatment of the Jewish people in the 19th century in Germany indicates exactly where that kind of language and that kind of racism leads us to. There is no place for it whatsoever anywhere in our party or our society, and there never will be, as far as I'm concerned.
You see, what Jewish members of the Labour Party say is, if this was black or Asian people who are victims of racism, you would listen to them. But when Jews say that your party under your leadership is infected with anti-Jewish hatred, you say, no, I know better.
I don't know better than anybody. I listen to people and amend, if necessary, the rules and processes. I'm the leader that introduced an investigation process, introduced a disciplinary process, introduced a process of education, introduced a process for dealing with egregious cases. And yes, we have suspended or expelled members where we have found them guilty of anti-Semitic behaviour, as indeed other parties have done the same. But there are problems of Islamophobia within our society also, as you quite rightly draw attention to, and there are problems of language that is used. I do not ever use racist language in any form to describe anybody in this world or in our society.
Let's be clear, you're saying that
we
he
need
does.
a world where we treat people with respect.
You're saying that he does. I think he's clearly saying, Mr Johnson, if you want to reply, that he thinks you have used
I missed that, but let me respond by saying that I think that Mr Corbyn, I'm sure, is very well intentioned, but I think that in his handling of this particular issue, his unwillingness to take a stand, to stand up for Jewish people in the Labour Party, his unwillingness to protect them, to put an arm around them, is, in my view, a failure of leadership. You cannot be neutral on questions like this any more, in my view, than you can try to lead this country and be neutral on the issue of Brexit. And it is a failure to take a stand, to have a point of view that in the end will cost this country gravely and deeply. And I don't want to waste another year, next year and more, in vacillation and confusion about what sort of position Mr Corbyn is willing to take, what sort of leadership he's willing to...
A failure of leadership is when you use racist remarks to describe people in different countries or in our society. I will never do that, and my party will never do that. And
Jeremy Corbyn, he makes a point that one way to take hate more generally out of politics, he argues, is to sort this Brexit row out because it's infecting our politics. Whatever your view is of it,
Brexit,
do you disagree with that?
Of course there has to be a solution to it, but...
What's your solution?
Well, I've made that quite clear, actually. I'm not sure if you've been saying that. But the point is about the cohesion of our... The point is about the cohesion of our society. I hope the Prime Minister understands the hurt that people feel when they hear remarks and articles that he's written in the past. I hope he will regret those, and I hope he will understand the importance of all of us using respectful language of all faiths, all religions and all languages in what is a multicultural society, which I'm proud to live in.
Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a couple more questions that we want to get through if we've got time. Our next question is from Katrina Harradine, please. Katrina Harradine.
In the era of fake news, what punishment do you think is appropriate for elected politicians who lie during political campaigns?
What punishment is appropriate for elected politicians who lie during political campaigns? Boris Johnson.
Well, they should be made to go on their knees through the chamber of the House of Commons, scourging themselves with copies of their offending documents, which claim to prove one thing and actually prove something quite different.
Jeremy Corbyn?
I think it's important when people go into an election campaign, they put forward a policy of what they're going to do, they put forward a policy of how they're going to pay for it, and if they don't deliver, then there is a democratic process to deal with that in the future. That is what democracy is about. It's about holding people to account and holding government to account in Parliament. And I want to see not a weaker, but a stronger House of Commons in the future that holds our government to account to make sure we deliver on the promises of reducing poverty in Britain.
Thank you. Boris Johnson, does it worry you that a leading British diplomat has resigned today, saying that she would no longer want to peddle half-truths on behalf of a government I do not trust?
Well, I don't know who you're referring to, but what it shows to me is that we need to move on as a country, because there are plenty of people who are irreconcilably opposed to Brexit, and I think that actually what we should do is respect the will of the people. People talk about trust in politics. Look at the promises that were made repeatedly by Mr. Corbyn, by all the other parties, that they would honour the referendum result. They're refusing to do it. Here we stand at this critical moment in our country's history. It's our chance on Thursday to honour our democracy and get Brexit.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
There has to be a test.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, Mr. Corbyn, if you would.
There has to be a test on the statements made. And so when people paint slogans on the side of a bus that are totally unsustainable, perhaps it's time that we did have an independent monitoring of what goes on.
Brief response, Mr. Johnson.
Well, actually, if you look at the numbers we put on the side of us, look at the gross figure we pay to the EU, the number is going up. And it is one of the advantages of our deal that we will take back control of our money, our borders, our laws, our immigration system. It's very, very clear. It's there in black and white. After 55 minutes, we still do not know what Mr. Corbyn's deal would be, and we still don't know whether he would back it, nor do we know who in his shadow cabinet he is proposing to deploy to negotiate that deal, because not a single one of them actually backs it.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, that's all the time we've got for questions now. Each leader has got 30 seconds for their closing statement. Again, the order was decided by the toss of a coin. Boris Johnson chose to go last, so can I ask Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader, to make your closing statement, Mr. Corbyn?
People say that politics doesn't change anything, but it can. It was a radical Labour government that created our National Health Service and rebuilt Britain. Today, we must be ambitious on the same scale. The future really is ours to make together. We can tackle the climate emergency, end child poverty, and properly fund our National Health Service. On Thursday, you can choose hope and vote for real change.
Thank you, Mr. Corbyn. Mr. Johnson, your closing statement, please.
This Thursday, we can choose another hung parliament under Mr. Corbyn and Nicola Sturgeon with 2 chaotic referendums, or else we can get Brexit done, get out of neutral, and get a parliament that works for you and on your priorities. The NHS, the cost of living, 20,000 more police, more cash for our schools. Let's get it done. Let's move on and vote Conservative on Thursday.
Thank you, Boris Johnson. Thank you, Jeremy